Okay, yeah, I've got it. I've got you on our TBOF page.
Okay, well,
So that worked.
all righty.
Dominique, just please see your phone from the message I sent.
Yes. All righty. Well, hello everyone. For those who are watching us live on Facebook, and we are about to start our webinar. So if you want to give us just a few minutes, we thank you for your patience. We're going to start admitting our attendance in, and we will start up, I would say, in about 3 minutes. Thank you again. Hello, everyone. We're going to be starting in about 2 minutes, just making sure that everyone is able to log on before we start up. I just want to welcome everyone quickly to our webinar tonight, and thank you all for joining us. If I'm just going to quickly, a little bit of webinar etiquette, I'll ask everyone to please keep your mics off during our presentation. We will have a Q&A afterwards. Feel free to type in any questions you may have in the dialogue, in the chat box. We have some wonderful support who will be helping glean through those chat questions and send them off to us so that we can ask them as well during the Q&A period. We're hoping to get to as many questions as possible, but time permitting, because we do have quite a number of questions that came into us over the week. And when we sent out an invitation to our members and our volunteers to send us questions regarding Bill C21 and firearm legislation in Canada. So I guess it's 7:05 now. I'd like to welcome everybody who's joined us here on the webinar and anybody who is watching us on our social media platforms. This is our second in what we hope will be a long series of educational and empowering webinars to bring to your attention and to the attention of our membership and the public, important issues that matter to us, that affect our day-to-day lives, affect our now, our present, and our future. So without too much delay here, again, welcome everyone. Please remember, keep your mics off until our Q&A period, and then please put your hands up if you have questions you'd like to ask, and we will take those questions as we go. Before we start, again, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. Tonight's webinar is going to be on Bill C21 and government's bid to control our day-to-day lives in a variety of different ways. In this particular way, it's controlling firearms and our self-protection. We have as our guest tonight someone who has been working on these issues and studying them for years, Mr. Rob Boutelier. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly, Rob. He will be educating us on not only the history of firearm legislation in Canada, but just a little bit about how impactful it's been, as well as some other countries and what they've done, and you know, some who have greater firearm control than us, some who have less, and what impact that has had. So anyway, before we get into our discussion, and I think it's going to be a very interesting and enlightening discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce myself for those of you who are new to our little webinar series. My name is Dominique Fournier. And I've been involved with Taking Back Our Freedoms pretty much since it was birthed by our founders, George Bears and Roy Beyer. I got involved because I was a frustrated mama bear, grandma bear, friend, daughter, sister who was watching what I believe to be my beautiful community fall apart as we just ran around like chickens without a head, terrified of things that in my mind we didn't need to be afraid of, and how our government sadly used that fear to implement things that never should have been implemented. So I started to speak out at rallies and whatnot, and got involved with a beautiful lady who I'll introduce to you in a moment, Dr. Lana Nickel, and some other beautiful souls who've been involved with TBOF and with the freedom movement for the last 2 to 3 years now. That's kind of how I got involved. And I'll let Lana introduce herself. Dr. Lana Nickel, my friend, my sister, my soul sister, and a fellow freedom fighter who I admire tremendously. Dr. Lana.
Thanks, Dominique. It's so nice to be with all of you again this evening. I'm so loving these webinars. So excited to learn and just take in as much as I can tonight from Rob and from all the questions. It's going to be an amazing evening. But yes, I'm Dr. Lana Nickel. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, and I'm one of the national directors with Take Back Our Freedoms, which I've been a part of well over a year. Just really, you know, similar to Dominique, I'm a mom of 4 young kids under 12. And, you know, when I saw what was going on, I was like, wow, like this is, you know, I knew right away, I'm like, this is not where we want to be headed. I'm in health and wellness and have been for over 25 years. And the bells and whistles were going off immediately for me. So it's been, for me, there was no hesitation that I needed to stand in alignment with my values and stand up and speak up. And I was always taught to do that. So that's what I've been doing and speaking all over the province. I've been very blessed to be involved with different organizations and groups within Canada, some even international groups. And I love being part of Taking Back Our Freedoms because we love to work as a team with other groups in Canada with no ego, just here to help, do what we can. You know, we were just instrumental with many different groups. James Top, you know, who marched across Canada. We were with him like literally almost every day doing stuff. There's been many groups that we love to support because we want all Canadians to be supported on these issues. You know, I'm sure you're like me, like I'm a very patriotic Canadian and I don't want to see my country fall. I love our beautiful country and we really need to protect it. So that's why I'm all in. So I'm really excited again to be with you tonight. I'm going to just give a little announcement as well. For those of you guys who don't know, Christine Anderson, she is a European Union member of Parliament who is a warrior. I literally watched her very early in this whole thing. And I was like, this is the kind of leadership we need. We need dragon slayers. And man, did she ever stand up. And, you know, it was our Canadian truckers that inspired her to really even turn it up a whole notch. She has been a champion for Canadians and for, you know, working families and working people and really the foundation of each country around the world, right? And she was just incredible for supporting Canadians and again, Freedom Convoy. So she is actually coming to Canada, February 18th through the 25th. And she's doing some speaking tours. There's even some VIP dinners. You can come and hear her speak. So I'm so excited to share that with you. So make sure you go to the website. I will put it in the chat, but it's literally what would Christine Anderson do? tour. So WWCAD tour.com, right? And she's coming to Calgary on February 18th. That's where she's kicking off her tour, then going through Toronto, Whitby, and Montreal, and then flying home. So we're very blessed to have her and thankful that TBOF can be a part of supporting that as well. So I'll put it in the chat, and we're going to have many more webinars upcoming, very exciting topics. You know, we've asked you, you know, our fellow Canadians, what do you want to hear on? What do you want to learn on? And we've been given some great feedback. We want to thank all of you for giving that to us, because it helps us know how we can become more independent, more strong, more powerful together and learn. So keep your eyes out, go to TBOF.ca and make sure that you're on our email web, on our newsletter. And you'll find out about all the incredible initiatives, from notice of liabilities with physicians and nurses that have been going out across the Canada, to our national citizens inquiry that's coming up. Like, there's many things going on, and we all just need to band together. So I'll pass it back to you, Dominique, with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lana Nicol. And I just want to give a quick plug for Dr. Nicol. She recently became certified in blood microscopy. Wow, that's a mouthful. And is exploring people's live blood and finding some pretty incredible stuff there. So if you are interested, please contact her. Put a note in the chat. If you're interested in getting more information. She and myself both also work with YYC Rocks Wellness Community, where there is a plethora of other health and wellness support. So again, you can also check them out. We are very honored to be connected, as Dr. Lana says, to a number of different incredible freedom groups. And that is the beauty of TBOF, is our ability and our willingness to work across the board with groups that really are looking to enhance our capacity to be free agents and make our decisions, not controlled by government, not controlled by big pharma or big organizations. We make our choices, not them. So as we enter into this discussion of free agency, I would like to introduce to you our speaker for tonight. His name is Rob Boutelier. Sorry, Rob, I'm pronouncing it in French because it's a French name. You can correct it when you come on. And Rob grew up on a farm and had early experience with firearm use and ownership. He has a black badge in IPSC, International Practical Shooting Confederation, and as part of his recent foray into tactical education and training. As a political commentator, Rob has spent extensive time and effort researching case law and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with a specific emphasis on gun ownership. He has interviewed many politicians, MPs, and well-known public figures such as Theo Fleury, Kyle Kemper, Pastor Art Pawlowski, and his videos have millions of views. The right of citizens to own and use firearms exists as a means not only to provide for ourselves, but to ensure that there is a balance in place to protect against oppressive and aggressive governments. Rob, the floor is yours. I'm so excited about this.
Thank you, Dominique. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, I'm going to warn everybody, I've taken up a hobby of collecting animals here recently. So I have 2 puppies and a kitten in the house, as well as a 5-year dog. So you might hear some rustling in the background here. I also have a 12-year-old upstairs who's in a very intense game of Fortnite right now. So with me here, a lot of screaming at the TV here in a few moments, but I've asked them to be quiet. So yeah, it's a little rambunctious here, but yeah, thank you for the introduction. I pronounce my last name Boutelier. I'm from Glace Bay in Cape Breton, and it's such a non-French pronunciation. All of my French teachers in school just loved my last name, but they were always disappointed when I told them how I pronounce it. So, but you did a great job. Thank you for the awesome introduction. I really appreciate it. Yes, so been doing commentary since 2017 now. I actually stepped the scene when between Trudeau and Notley, when they really started destroying Alberta. I was completely politically apolitical at that point. I was not interested in politics. I was raising a young family, 3 kids, pair of twins, and a 12-year-old, 9 and 12 ages children. So I had no interest until I started feeling the pain and I started understanding what was happening around us. Again, back to my upbringing, heavily involved in firearms as a child and as a teenager and as a young adult on a farm, using them for actually, acquiring food, down animals, things like that, pest control, coyotes, things like that, lots of hunting and that on that end. And recently, now that I kid of the age where I can kind of step out and take on some hobbies and stuff, I got into the tactical side of things. I've got my black badge. Took about 30 to 40 hours worth of tactical pistol training last year. Fired about, I'd say, 9,000 round 9mm, which probably why I'm forced right now. That's a whole different story altogether. Yeah, so that's my background, guys. I think tonight I just kind of, I've got some high level notes here. I wanted to start with just a bit of a history of gun control in Canada, because it's a lot deeper than people understand. Everybody thinks, they think about, when the long gun ban or the long gun registry was put in place in the 90s, right up to 2012 when it was removed. Like, everybody has a light version of history when it comes to firearms, but it's a lot deeper than what people understand it. And some of the things that drove gun control in the past would surprise people as well, because people often look at firearms owners as being a certain type of people. When in actuality, a lot of the gun control measures originally implemented within Canada were racially based and were for the purpose of suppressing minorities, things like that. So it's a really interesting background on firearms we have. So, when you look at the 1700s and 1867, when the British North American Act was implemented, firearms control flipped in many different ways. It wasn't consistent. It was always ad hoc. It was always knee-jerk reaction to a populace that they wanted to suppress, or a militia that they wanted to build. And that went on all the way up until 1967. Now, again, just to touch on it, a lot of the gun control measures that were put in place, pre-Confederation, were minority group based. They didn't want Aboriginals and Indigenous people to have firearms. They didn't want certain groups, Irish settlers. They didn't want people to have firearms out of the fear of an uprising. And that's typically why government implements gun control, is because they are afraid of what the populace is going to do. Now, when British America Act was introduced in 1867, I believe it was like mid 1880s, that's when the first attempt to disarm Indigenous people was really formally put forward. Now, what the government felt was it would be too hard to actually disarm the Indigenous populace, so they actually deployed another tactic, was restricting the sales and provision of ammunition to Indigenous people in a way that essentially rendered their firearms useless at that point in time. And again, back to the deep, kind of racist roots of gun control. We know what happened to the Indigenous population in Canada after they were disarmed, and during the disarmament, and even leading up to it. If we go pre-Confederation, mid 1700s to the 1867 British North Americans Act, a lot of Indigenous groups, there was always an effort to suppress firearms ownership because the government did not want any kind of conflict to occur with the Indigenous people when they were taking land, things like that. And when we talk about residential schools, that was all under the guise of the government implementing strong gun control measures against Indigenous people in Canada. When we talk about handguns, something people, revolvers kind of came into, I believe, late 1700s, between 1800 and 1850 is roughly when revolvers started coming to be. The country didn't have a lot of concern for handguns until then, because most of the thing was, up until that point, arms were highly ineffective, highly unreliable, difficult to use, inaccurate. They weren't really done well at that point in time, but over time, as engineering got better, they got more effective. They were able to fire at longer ranges, and that's when people really started getting concerned with firearms. So handguns came into play, roughly, I'm going to say, mid to late 1800s is when they start restricting the ownership of handguns when revolvers were introduced. And it was because, and this is kind of a key when it comes to firearms, is firearms and control. Gun control serves no purpose other than to improve safety. There's not a single gun control measure that's ever been implemented in Canada that prevents somebody from committing harm with a firearm. Every gun control measure in Canada has contributed to an extremely safe environment to use firearms within and reduce the possibility of accidental discharge. And we'll go into current legislation and current gun rules and how that serves that purpose, right? That's essentially what it is. You will never, through gun control, stop somebody from acquiring a weapon of any type and committing a homicide or committing a violent act. So handguns were actually, from the get-go, as soon as they became effective, handguns were always heavily managed, heavily restricted in Canada. In the 1920s, when the introduction of permits to acquire and own firearms began to be introduced, and over the decades between the 1920s, up until we ended up with the FAC situation, the possession and ownership of firearms, they were playing with different versions of permitting and how that might out, and all of them ineffective to a great extent. But the 1920s is when that started coming to be. 1930 to 1944, the government toyed with the concept of firearms registration, specifically around pistols. So they were always heavily regulated, always heavily managed. There were always laws against, possessing pistols for anything other than necessary self-defense or target shooting, things like that. But in the 1930s to the 1945, that's when we actually started looking at registration of pistols, much heavier arm of the government coming in and managing pistol ownership when it comes to firearms. So as you can see, throughout the history of Canada, pistols have always been something been heavily regulated within Canada. Now, when we get into the late 60s, that's when we started introducing different classes of firearms. So we get into prohibited, restricted, and non-restricted. That concept was introduced into the 60s. Now, that's when, I believe personally, that's when the government started really cracking down and trying to, I like to consider it the beginning disarmament process, because essentially look at restricted, non-restricted, and prohibited. Sure, prohibited, we're talking automatic weapons, that's a whole different animal. When you look at restricted, unrestricted, it's a semi-automatic firearm that has a rate of fire of 1 trigger pull per round. And to me, the Trojan horse that was introduced when we started rolling out restricted, prohibited, and non-restricted was it allowed them to actually move the agenda forward faster now, because they could apply different regulations to different classes of firearms. So they essentially broke them into 3 groups, and then strategically could move one group further ahead in the agenda than the other, and have better control over the populace and move towards that disarmament agenda that's prominent today. 1977 is when the FAC came to be. Also the prohibition of fully automatic firearms. Now, to be clear, 1977, when we hear the term assault style firearm, well, the government uses assault style weapon designed with the intent to kill the largest number of people possible in the shortest amount of time. That's the terminology they use. In 1977, anything that was technically an assault weapon or rifle was prohibited. Nobody could own them from that point forward. What the government describes as an assault style weapon right now is functionally no different than any other automatic firearm on the market. There is no advantage to using, a firearm that the government deems to be that type over a wood stock rifle that is semi-automatic. Same rate of fire, one bullet per trigger pull, same legal magazine capacity, the whole 9 yards. So that's when technically the assault weapons ban occurred, was in 77. In the early to mid 90s, the requirement to obtain a firearms acquisition certificate increased tremendously, including, background checks, references, safe training. And this was when the prohibition of large capacity magazine was introduced and rolled out. And then for the rest of the 90s, the focus was mainly around tightening compliance with the requirements had been rolled out. So actually getting everybody in line with the requirements. It was a big animal for them to get their arms around. So they put a lot of focus into that. Then in the mid 90s, that is when also the long gun registry, the dreaded long gun registry that was a failure from the get-go, that was introduced in the mid 90s as well. And one thing we'll talk about in a little bit is the correlation between Canada's attempts to get more control over firearms. And when you look at Australia and Britain at that same time, that was when they rolled out significant firearms legislation and banning as well. And we'll talk about how effective that actually was when you look at the numbers here in a little bit. So we had the long gun registry, and then up around 2012, that's when the long gun registry essentially died and failed, and there was nothing that could really be done from that point there, right? Fast forward, everything was actually relatively comfortable within the firearms industry between 2012 long gun registry. There was nothing major that was implemented between the end of the long gun registry and when Trudeau came into power. May 1st, 2020, that's when the Trudeau regime implemented the OIC, prohibiting more than 1,500 models of what they deemed to be assault style firearms. Now, to talk about the OIC for a few moments here, and this is something people don't fully understand, is that is not anything that goes through legislation. That's not anything that goes through the House of Commons. That is not anything that is voted on. The way an order in council works is the Queen's Privy Council forms a recommendation, and they are actually covered under privilege. Nobody can see the information. And that's what the CCFR is fighting about. Nobody can see the information that was used to base that recommendation off of. And OIC is the Queen's Privy Council, which is lifelong members of the political system who are highly paid and get down and just kind of comfortably just have coffee and talk about this stuff. They can form any kind of recommendation they want, and they take it to a corresponding minister. In this case, it was Bill Blair, the public safety minister. The public safety minister takes it to the Governor General, Julie Payette at the time, and if she agrees with the recommendation from the Queen's Privy Council, it then gets implemented. And that's it. That's all. Those are all the steps that were followed to ban 1,500 variants of firearm on May 1st of 2020. There were no other steps, right?
Insane.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely insane. And the other thing too, Dominique, is when you look at the costs, when you look at the firearms businesses that suffered now because they had stuff they couldn't sell, they had stuff that was basically rendered useless at that point in time, and then all the people with these firearms in their safes that they used as well. And the key being here, this is all done in the name of public safety, and there is virtually no connection between what they're doing and an improvement in public safety whatsoever. Accidental discharge based on previous legislation was reduced to the point it can't be reduced anymore. So everything they're doing now serves nothing to improve public safety in any way, shape, or form. So we have 1,500 variants of firearms that were banned, that were prohibited because the Queen's Privy Council made a recommendation that the Governor General agreed to. And we all know we're in a very liberalized system, right? Yeah. Go ahead, Dominique.
Sorry, Rob. So let me just wrap my head around this. All of these firearms were banned not because there was any debate in Parliament amongst political representatives, but because there was a recommendation made by a small group of people and it got passed. And then it became law. Is that what you're telling me?
100%. And the recommendation, whatever information they use to form the recommendation, is privileged. It's confidential. We don't have access to that information to see why in the world they would have decided to ban the firearms that they actually ended up banning with that OIC, right?
Well, and those of us with conspiratorial minds are kind of the wheels are turning and going, well, of course they don't want to see why they are actually wanting to do this, because if it was not nefarious, it would be open. It would be open for the public to see. The rationale would be there and properly explained, debated, discussed, and voted on. Is that accurate?
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
100%. But again, we're in, it's all lawfare, it's all political warfare that's being wielded here. And it's funny, actually, the OIC is what was used back in the 1800s to limit the firearms possession and ownership of Indigenous people. So it's funny to see it come back full circle, and now they actually go for the complete disarmament of the population using the same mechanism within the political system to do that, right? So that's just something I found interesting, was that the same thing they used to violate the rights and freedoms of individuals in Canada and then commit gross atrocities is what they did in 2020 when they actually banned outright 1,500 variants of firearm, right?
Unbelievable.
So then we fast forward to Bill C21. One thing that I'm actually going to state here is I didn't spend much time at all reading deeply into Bill C21. I can actually share a video with everybody where there is one politician who tore it to shreds. And The reason I didn't spend much time on it is because every step the government has taken to this point only serves to the populace. It does not serve to improve public safety. And if you read even a relatively small amount of Bill C21, what you notice is it's broadly written with language that is designed to be freely interpreted by the Supreme Court to further impede on the firearms rights of Canadians. So when you actually start reading Bill C21, you can see very clearly it's a very loosely written amendment, and the intent goes from, you know, the OIC in May of 2020, where they outright banned firearms. Now they're trying to form language around what you can't use that is broad and interpretable, and that's the purpose of Bill C21. It's not what we immediately see them banning because of Bill C21. It's a Trojan horse that essentially, and again, this is my opinion, but I think everything the government has done, the Trudeau government has implemented more prohibition and more firearms disarmament than any government in the history of Canada since Confederation. And when you look at Bill C21, everything that's written in that document is intended to allow them to expand greatly on what they've already banned, including there was one piece in the legislation regarding magazine capacity. And what it actually stated was, not only are you restricted to 5-round magazines, but if your firearm is capable of accepting a magazine that exceeds 5 rounds, then it's a prohibited firearm. Think about that for a moment. There is not a variant of firearm on the market right now that does not accept a magazine that is engineered to hold more than 5 rounds. Canada is the place that says pin it at 5 rounds. Every other country makes magazines that are engineered that firearm to accept more than 5 rounds. I've got a WK-180C. It hasn't hit the list yet. Likely with Bill C21, it would be gone. That comes with a magazine that can hold 30 rounds that's pinned at 5 rounds. So right out of the gates, that's designed to accept a magazine of more than 5 rounds. So this is a massive violation of firearms rights in Canada. And the unfortunate part is we get into the conversation about hunting rifles, and we'll talk in a few minutes about, you know, the fallacy of that argument when we talk about the legislation, what they're putting forward, and what we don't like about it versus actually outright opposing any firearms legislation whatsoever, right? So that's kind of a quick and dirty history of firearms gun control in Canada. I guess, Dominique, I don't know how you want to do this, but I've got some notes here. I'm just kind of moving through them as I go, but that was kind of the first topic I wanted to touch on. Did we want to stop there and talk a bit, or did we just want to keep going here?
Maybe what I'll ask you, and I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but for those people who might want to delve deeper into the history of firearm legislation in Canada, because obviously we can't talk about it all right now, do you have any recommendations of sources or maybe even websites that they could go to get a more extensive understanding of that?
I'm going to tell you, right, it's an expensive book, but it's an incredibly written book. It's not from any liberal or conservative perspective. It is an absolute history of control in Canada, and it's called Arming and Disarming: A History of Gun Control in Canada by R. Blake Brown. It's a phenomenal read, and it is so incredibly detailed. You can Google all day long about gun control in Canada and get snippets and pieces and everything. Get that book.
What's the author's name again?
It was R. Blake Brown, Arming and Disarming: A History of Gun Control in Canada.
Okay,
it's an incredibly well written book.
All right, for anybody who's interested, I just popped it into the chat. And so maybe go look that up if you would like something more extensive. I think that was a pretty good summary and synopsis. I think we might probably flesh out more of that when we go through our Q&A, because some of the questions are kind of around a little bit of the history, but by all means, keep going. So far, so good. Very interesting. Thank you, Rob.
Good. Okay. The next up is, when we talk about disarmament and gun control, we look at the strategy. Now, I've explained the OIC and how they bypassed virtually every safeguard within our current political process to actually implement the OIC and disarm Canadians to a great extent. In the absence of any justification, not a single logical justification for the prohibition of a single firearm on the list. And I think the key being there, okay, gun control has nothing to do with public safety, and it only reinforces safe usage and prevention of accidental discharge. Now, when you look statistically, you talk about the homicides per Canada with firearms. There's roughly, you know, and it fluctuates, but let's say it's about 200 a year homicides in Canada. It's a relatively small number compared to a lot of things that harm Canadians. When you look at PAL holders and our PAL holders in Canada, there's a professor by the name of Barry Mauser. He's a doctor, he's a professor. He's done a huge amount of research into PAL holders and licensed, legal, law-abiding firearms owners in Canada. And what he actually concluded was a licensed firearms owner in Canada is actually 1/2 to 1/3 as likely to commit a homicide via any means than a member of the general population. So when you PAL holders and our PAL holders, we are held to the strictest regulations. We are held to the strictest legislation. The hoops we jump through to get what we get and do what we do automatically knocks us out of the general population as far as compliance with legislation and laws and things. And then when you measure the effect we have on society, again, it's 1/2 to 1/3 as likely to commit a homicide as the same people who are attempting to disarm us. That's key. Now, people like to center the conversation around firearms, but when we talk and the thing that people always do is they say firearms, firearms, firearms. They never consider homicides by any means, right? So you can eliminate firearms, and we'll talk about that in a bit. You can eliminate firearms from a society to a great extent, but then your knife crime goes up, right?
Like in Britain.
Then that happens. And people don't kill by default when they have a firearm. You know, people kill when they're bad people. Socioeconomic conditions contribute a great deal to murders and homicides and violent crime, things like that. But what this government does is they very keenly focus on one thing and convince all of the people who can't think for themselves that one thing is be all end all to the that we're experiencing within society, right? When we talk about some of the tactics they've deployed, I mean, propaganda is a huge piece. The other thing that's happened throughout Canada over the decades and over the centuries is the demonization of self-defense and the lawfare people who actually defend themselves with firearms, things like that. They've completely eroded the logic around self-defense. Recently, Justin Trudeau said you cannot in Canada use a firearm for the purpose of self-defense, which a lot of Canadians sit down and think, yeah, that's what our laws say, but nobody actually zeroes in on how absolutely ridiculous that statement is. Most of the world now lives under some type of authoritarian leadership or dictator. I'm a firm believer that every citizen of every country on the face of the planet have the means to defend themselves, not only from violent crime and violent people, but to defend themselves from the government. And a big part of the argument that comes in, everybody says, what are you going to do about against the government? They have, you know, superior firearms, they have all of this stuff. And they kind of lose the plot. They think that the intent is to defeat. The intent is not to defeat. The intent is to create enough opposing pressure to government action that the government treat populace with a heightened level of respect and a heightened level of appreciation. And that's what we see in the States. The States, you know, everybody laughs about what they consider to be gun nuts. You can't do anything against F-35s. But I'll tell you, the last thing that a government wants to do is end up in a battle with their citizens that are heavily equipped and heavily capable and absolutely get destroyed politically as a result of that. So the importance of firearms is not so that we fight the government and win. It is to put that barrier in place that it is much more difficult to have situations like what played out over the last 2 years play out, where the government just freely takes control of everything and violates everybody's constitutional rights and freedoms on a whim, and there's no questions asked and nobody can debate it. And despite everything that's happened, Canadians still not in agreement when the government says you cannot use a firearm for the purpose of self-defense. What's really interesting is the bias towards criminals. Now, while the government was ramping up legislation against firearms owners, they were reducing consequences for criminals who commit crimes with illegal firearms. They've been doing that since day one. They've reduced sentencing for criminals who commit crimes with firearms. They've done all of this stuff. If you look at a self-defense situation in Canada, the person who is intent on harming your body has more right to dictate the outcome of that attack than you do as the person being attacked. That is the way this law works in Canada. And again, people tend to nod in agreement. And that's part of the power they have over us, is they've convinced people that being polite means we have to agree that the criminal has more right to dictate what they do to us than we have to defend ourselves. And you know, that summarizing, when you look within the criminal code, I forget the specific wording, but it's basically around using as much force as is necessary to defend yourself. But what people don't realize when we talk about self-defense, and anybody who's been in violent or physical confrontation before, is it's a lot like an insanity plea. You're not thinking, you know, logically when you're defending yourself. You're not thinking as though, you know, you're going to survive. You are trying to survive in that moment. You know, we've had many people get off on insanity. You know, we had the gentleman in Nova Scotia who beheaded a passenger on a bus and was out on insanity a few years later. Yet a licensed or a peaceful Canadian who simply defends himself or his property will likely end up in prison for doing so, without the consideration of the equivalent of insanity in the adrenaline rush and in that occurs to his body. We had a gentleman, and this is an Indigenous situation. There was a history between these two people. We had a man, I believe it was in Saskatchewan recently, who woke up to somebody stabbing him in the head. He fought the individual, got the knife away from the individual, stabbed the individual, and is now serving time in prison. He served 5 years for manslaughter for doing that. And he woke up to being stabbed. Now, I'm not saying we should do things that are unnecessary, but one thing to consider, I mean, we had that stabbing spree recently where many people were killed. What I don't understand about part of the law is, why are we being told we have to let somebody intent on harming people go away and continue to harm people if they are capable of doing so? So the self-defense piece in Canada is actually insane. But again, we've been convinced as a populace to sit down and be quiet and that you can't use firearms for self-defense, right? The other thing when we talk about firearms and the way the government does this is they are funding the disarmament of law-abiding peaceful Canadians who are statistically the most peaceful people in the entire country, in the amount of many billions of dollars for this disarmament piece. There is no translation into disarmament and public safety. There is no reduction in violent crime or even shooting as a result of the disarmament of peaceful Canadians. They are funding this in the amount of billions. But when you look at 65% of homicides are committed by gangs with illegal firearms, 95% of homicides with firearms are committed with illegally obtained firearms. They have committed $300 million as to that, which is, it's 95% of the problem they claim they're trying to solve. They've committed $300-ish million to that, and billions of dollars in resources into demonizing people like myself, who are highly responsible, who follow every law, who follow every regulation and every piece of legislation that's put forward, right? So those are some interesting pieces about how insane it is that what they've actually been doing, and how they've managed to shift this Overton window towards demonizing us through propaganda, through all of these things, and they've done it very successfully. One of the things that the government and many governments have going for them is people look at their actions and say they don't make sense, therefore the government is incompetent, when it's quite the opposite. These people are highly competent, they're highly organized, they're highly strategic, they're highly driven, and they know exactly what they're doing to us. And they have the benefit of us thinking they don't know what they're doing. When if you were to measure their performance in disarmament of Canadians through business metrics, you know, achieving their objective, they would be performing top tier, better than any business objective that you put forth in any business, in any industry. And that's the thing that kind of slips by, is everybody says it doesn't make sense, therefore they must be stupid, is what people say. When in actuality, we have to shift our paradigm. Yes, if their stated objective is what we believe they're trying to do, then it seems incompetent. But when you shift it to the disarmament of Canadians, every single thing they've done has been exceptionally effective at achieving their objective, right? Mm-hmm. And again, that's when we talk about a call to action, that's one of the pieces, is understanding that what they're saying they want to do is not what they actually want to do here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. Absolutely. No, very accurate. I actually had a conversation with someone last week where I got accused of being willing to put a gun in the hands of a child, but not willing to expose them to drag queen story hour. Now, we won't get into that whole discussion. That's a different one altogether.
Wow. Wow.
But-
I would love to be involved in a conversation like that.
But essentially what I was being told is that, you know, it's a responsibility on my part that I don't fear the idea of my children learning how to handle firearms. But I have concerns about my small children being in the presence of an adult entertainer. And this is kind of the intellectual gymnastics that we've allowed to happen, where we have so vilified the idea of a tool, like a hammer is a tool. People don't say, oh, you're crazy for putting a hammer in your child's hand. They don't say, oh, you're crazy for putting a pen in your child's hands. You can do a lot of damage with a pen, euphemistically speaking. But a tool becomes actually the controller, you know, and of course we've all heard, well, what causes more deaths? Automobiles. Well, we're not banning them.
Yeah.
Right. So again,
I actually, coming up to your point, I have a whole piece on whataboutism and how important it actually is. It's
well,
used
good.
to shut
I'm
down
looking forward to
conversation,
that.
but it's something that we should proudly beat our chests over, because it is a measure of people and their ideals and how consistent they are.
Yeah.
And they try to shut down argument and debate by saying this is whataboutism, when it's like it is, and it's important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're very poor at doing it. They're claiming that exposing your child to, you know, drag queen story hour is somehow, you know, morally equal to training them to use firearms safely and effectively. Next up, actually wanted to talk about the fallacy in the Britain and Australia debate that's used. It's actually the opposite of what people claim it is. And this is everybody can go in and research this stuff. This is factual. People like to, and you see it on purpose, debate gun legislation and gun control and its effectiveness. And they actually sit down and they claim very broadly, look at Australia. That's all they say. Mic drop Australia. Look at what they did and how effective it was. When in fact, what Australia demonstrated is actually the opposite. More firearms concentrated in the people like me who like firearms and are highly interested in them, the better. Because right now, today, in the mid-90s, they went on this disarmament campaign and they increased the threshold for people to acquire firearms. In the mid-90s, Australia did that. What people don't understand is actually the rate of firearms ownership in Australia is higher today than it was even in the mid-90s, after they banned, you know, they say they banned firearms, which they actually didn't ban at all. There are more guns in the hands of people who they claim are the dangerous people with firearms in Australia today than there have ever been in the history of Australia. Wow. And, you know, when you look on a per capita basis, I believe it's, I forget what the number is, but it is the highest amount of gun ownership ever in Australia on a per capita basis when you look at total firearms spread over the population in Australia. And in the same period of time, so in the mid-90s, they implemented what to be these strong gun control measures that actually resulted in many more firearms in the hands of people who are passionate about firearms. Mm-hmm. The homicide rate was halved in Australia, okay? From mid-90s to 2022, when you look at the data. You know where else the homicide rate was halved from the mid-90s to 2022 without any gun control measures whatsoever in place? The United States. The homicide rate saw an equivalent reduction in the United States as Australia did over the same period of time, with no gun control measures put in place whatsoever. Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots of stuff wrong with the states and firearms and everything, and I'll never sit down and argue the amount, the proliferation of firearms, the way, you know, the wrong people have them in the states is great, but the homicide rate factually was almost halved in the states over the same period of time as Australia had their homicide rate with what they claim to be the complete disarmament of the population, which wasn't a disarmament at all. So that argument that people make about Australia and gun control is actually 100% off of what they claim it to be. Now, another interesting happened roughly the same time, and that's when Britain disarmed their population, and they are actually quite effective at it. They did a pretty good job of getting firearms out of the hands of citizens. Interestingly, the homicide rate in Britain in the mid-90s was 1.2 per 100,000. Today it's 1.12. So they didn't even have the benefit of the cultural shift that resulted in having homicide rates over the same period of time as the US and Australia. So Britain's gun control measures not only did virtually none, but they actually performed more poorly on the world stage than other developed nations is in regards to homicide rates, same period of time. And arguably, knife attacks are absolutely terrifying. So it's like, I actually was debating with an individual and they said, well, at least people aren't being killed with guns. And I was like, that's a terrible argument. Knives are horrifying. Any type of attack is horrifying, but knives terrify me more than anything.
No kidding.
So those arguments are completely bunk. And what it is, it's that example that they throw out there expecting the whole conversation to stop. But when people take enough time to dig into these numbers, this is what they find is these measures did the opposite of what people claim they did. So when people claim Britain and Australia in the gun control debate, they're actually supporting what I'm saying when you really reveal the numbers to them and show them what actually happened in those nations at that same period of time, right? The next piece regarding the legislation and how they achieve their objective and do what they do is I trained mixed martial arts for a very long time. And anybody who's in boxing or mixed martial arts, there's a concept called punching through the target. So and this is where gun owners in Canada fall short is the government punches through the target. And how they punch through the target is what they did with Bill C21. They roll out sweeping, ridiculous amendments and legislation that achieve probably 3 times as much as they're actually hoping to achieve. And then when the dust settles and everybody's debating, fighting over it, they get probably even more than they were looking for when they rolled it out. And unfortunately, that's a strategy, a negotiation strategy. When you're negotiating contracts, that's what you do. You ask for far more than you're looking for, and then you whittle it down to what makes sense and what's reasonable. On our side, we never punch through the target. We never even achieve a remote repeal of any kind of legislation. What we do is we barely even strike the target, and we beg for mercy that the government doesn't take more from us than they're already proposing. And that's a big flaw in the firearms community is most of the conversations when you hit forums online revolve around, what am I to expect? Is this firearm now illegal? This and that. And again, punching through the target is a tactic that these people play effectively. And again, they've convinced us to be polite in our interactions and that self-defense is wrong and all these things. So all we ever hope for is that whatever they're proposing will go through. And when, Bill C21, when the government steps back, says, oh, I understand all your concerns with hunting rifles. We're going over that part a little bit. Everybody breathes a sigh of relief. And what they don't realize they're doing is by doing that, they're nodding in agreement with the government that everything else in that legislation is okay for them to move forward. And that's the strategy, that's the objective, that's what they deploy to actually achieve their objective, right? The next piece, regarding how the government does this. Can you hear the puppies in the background I warned you about?
That's what that was. Okay, I was worried someone's mic
Melody.
was off and they were making.
No, it's mine. It's mine.
It's all good. It's all good.
Yeah, they're very. Oh, here she is on a visit. The other thing that the government has convinced us is polite and a liberalized system actually rules against is people keep telling me that Canada needs its own second amendment, and we have something that's actually, if it's interpreted properly, encompasses the 10th Second Amendment, and it's Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms: life, liberty, and security of the person. Now, something interesting about Section 7 is when you go back into case law, research charter PD, you look at things that have been justified under life, liberty, and security of the person. And one of the very controversial pieces of legislation that was put forward was the nulling of abortion laws in Canada. So abortion laws are on the books, but they're unenforceable. And it was all ruled by the Supreme Court that that's so under Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, specifically security of the person. The Supreme Court ruled that under security of the person, you cannot prevent somebody from obtaining an abortion because it violates that right. Interestingly, when you really think logically, the ultimate maintainer of life is a firearm. The ultimate maintainer of liberty is a firearm. and the ultimate maintainer of security of the person is a firearm. If that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't see politicians walking around with bodyguards strapped with firearms to maintain their security of the person and their life. And the problem being that in a heavily liberalized system, the government, the courts will rule against firearms ownership under Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person. But very purely, if you think about life, liberty, and security of the person, the ultimate maintainer of all of those things is firearms. And unfortunately, in Canada, the firearms community, and when we look at firearms lobby, things like that, we haven't done a good job of making that case or taking that fight to the courts. So again, I think there's a real opportunity for us to actually achieve some progress forward on firearms in Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, if the right strategy was deployed to do so.
Well, that makes perfect sense to me. And someone had asked in the chat, do we have anything within the Constitution that would help protect us and protect our ability to protect ourselves? And I cited Section 7 because logically, I can't imagine anyone disagreeing with that.
And again, if we're thinking logically, like what better maintainer of any of those things than you're ready to possess and defend those things with a firearm? When we talk about liberty, we're actually digging into government tyranny at that point. So again, we've got something very close to the Second Amendment. It's just not black and white like the Second Amendment tends to be, which makes it a lot more for interpretation. But as we saw in the last 2 years, as far as the Constitution and the interpretation of it goes, they could make the Constitution say anything they want based on the way their logic works, right?
Yeah. We had a question here, and we're going to get into this a little bit, but now that we're on the subject, because that occurred to me as well. What about property rights in the Bill of Rights? And someone, and we'll get to that in a little bit, and hopefully you can expand on that a little bit. But I've had a few questions around using the Bill of Rights. And if we look back at the history, and maybe you can touch on that, prior to the Charter of Rights, we had legislation that took away some of our rights to firearms when we had the Bill of Rights in place. So why wasn't that used as a means of protecting our rights? Interesting question.
Well, and again, it comes back to a liberalized system. Now, unfortunately, in these arguments, and again, the Bill of Rights still stands to an extent. The Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is also something that's referenced heavily, but it all comes down to interpretation of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, a liberalized Supreme Court, will interpret those documents in a way, and they will set precedent that then allows future Supreme Court rulings to be based on the precedent that they set. And that's where we lose every single time, is we've got a liberalized system within Canada that always rules against the intent of those things in the Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms are. But again, when part of my problem here is, and a great example is what happened with the convoy and how quickly we saw everything fall. Many mandates fell, and politicians claimed it wasn't due to the convoy, but obviously convoy, then mandates start falling across the country. We haven't had enough political pressure to really repeal or achieve what firearms owners seek to achieve within Canada. We've never had enough political pressure to defeat the intent of the liberalized Supreme Court within Canada. So that's where we fall down is, we can clearly interpret the Bill of Rights, Charter of Rights and Freedoms in a way that makes sense, but a liberalized Supreme Court will always rule against us and grant more power to the government in that ruling, right? I think that's part of why we haven't seen as many battles as we might like to see as well. It's not to say that everybody stepped back from the fight, but you do run the risk of them setting a precedent that even works more severely against firearms owners in Canada as a result of their ruling, which is, it's backwards land. It doesn't make sense because a lot of, that's not how it should work, but this is what we're left with in Canada. And this is why, the erosion of rights and freedoms has occurred so quickly, because they've been laying the groundwork for centuries now, as far as this liberal mentality goes and how much power is granted to the government.
Well, yeah, and we could get into a huge long conversation about, the current structure, that we have a court system with appointed judges, a Supreme Court with appointed judges. So depending on the ideological perspective of the government at the time who's appointing those judges, we have no idea really in the end how effective our rights are being protected at the level of the courts. And then, of course, our senators are also appointed. So we have this system where it's difficult, and judicial interpretivism has been around for decades. It's, if you listen to if you read anything by Ted Morton, Reiner Knopf on judicial interpretivism 30 years ago, they were warning about this. So this isn't new, what we're faced with, right? How do we protect against that? We could have multiple webinars on that.
And honestly, and we'll talk about the call to action, but political pressure is missing. There's no consequence for the actions of politicians in Canada.
Absolutely.
That ultimately they will freely interpret it to the advantage of the government every single time in an absence of any consequence, right? And that happens on the conservative side as well. I mean, the best we can hope from conservatives is there a placeholder until the machine to take our rights and freedoms away, turn back on, and continue away everything that we need, right? So, so that's what we run into here.
So we're hitting the top of the hour here, and we do want to have time for questions. So I'm going to stop interrupting you and let you finish up on your presentation, and then I'll bombard you with some questions.
I think we'll do, Dominique, aside from state jobs, which is I want to talk about is, and I think one point I'll make when it comes to what about, it's really important that we speak to the ideals and the morals of the people who are trying to take firearms away. And people tend to try to negate our arguments by claiming whataboutism and just leaving it at that we shouldn't actually make the points we're making because of that. But we're dealing with a government who is claiming they need to disarm Canadians because there's too many suicides with firearms, while at the same time expending medically assisted suicide to people with mental health issues. So again, we really do need to draw the distinction of the moral corruption that's happening here. We have people who demand that our property is taken and we are disarmed. Over 200 homicides committed a year by people who obtained firearms illegally and who are part of gangs. They will pound the table and demand that our firearms are taken away of safety, but sit there silently while 150,000 people die from smoking, drinking, and other causes that are all preventable as well. We have groups of doctors who advocate against firearms ownership because they claim that it's a bloodbath in their emergency rooms and in their operating rooms, while at the same time, medical malpractice kills 28,000 to 35,000 people a year in Canada. So whataboutism is a really important tool to us. And when people actually accuse us when we're in this debate of deploying whataboutism, we should double down, because they're trying to prevent us from exposing their moral corruption when they do that. That should automatically be an indication that we're getting there and that we need to go harder, not that we should, abide by their rules and not use whataboutism in our debate tactics here with these people, right? So that was the only thing I wanted to say about that piece. Getting into current firearms requirements in Canada. So I wanted to talk about what's currently in place. Me as a firearms owner, this is what I'm exposed to as a result of owning firearms in Canada. Starts with training, depending on whether you want restricted or restricted. Non-restricted is a 1-day course. Restricted, pistols, certain types of rifles, that's a 2-day course. It teaches you in detail how to handle, store, transport, and safely use your firearms. And once completed, you're then permitted to apply for a license. Upon applying for your license, you're background checked prior to being issued. Once you receive your license, you then go through the process called continuous eligibility. And this is another thing people don't realize is as a licensed firearms owner in Canada, there's a background check performed of me and the other couple million firearms owners automatically in the system every single day. Every 24 hours, this check occurs. And anything that's red flag that makes me a risk for owning firearms is then given to the RCMP as something they need to be concerned about. So when we talk about background checks, when we talk about not only do you need to provide references and do you need to actually get background checked upon acquisition of the license, every 24 hours, every single day, you are background checked to make sure you haven't committed a crime that makes you a risk to the public, right? So once you get your license, you can then purchase firearms and you can own firearms at that point in time, including restricted if you took the 2-day course. And upon purchasing, then your firearms need to be registered if they're restricted. And you can purchase rifles that there's no restriction, there's no registration, that I can go to Canadian Tire and buy a rifle today and go home with it, and there's nothing really done except for the records they keep on the purchases that are made, right? When it comes to modifying a firearm, anything done to allow it to discharge cartridges in a rapid succession is considered illegal in Canada, and it's very broadly stated in the law. So when you talk about, some of the modifications that are made in the States for semi-automatic rifles to be turned fully out, that's not permissible within Canada. We can't do that. And magazine capacity is capped at 5 rounds for rifles and 10 rounds for pistols. And armor piercing and explosive rounds are illegal. So the type of rounds we use are highly regulated as well. Now, when storing firearms, you're required to have a trigger lock or a cable lock. Ammunition is to be separate from the firearm. And, if you're transporting a pistol, for example, when I go to the range and I do pistol shooting, it has to be an opaque case, trigger locked with a lock on the case as well. And the ammunition stored separately. And then despite everything that we're being told about assault style firearms, they're not legally obtainable in Canada. You cannot obtain anything that actually is considered an assault rifle. The reason they actually claim it to be assault style rifle is for the purpose of making sure that they paint that picture in your mind of a scary rifle that can kill lots of people. When again, in all actuality, what they aim to be an assault style rifle is the same aesthetically is the same functionally as every other semi-automatic firearm that has a wooden stock. It's just aesthetically pleasing, right? So when it comes to firearms ownership, we're highly regulated, highly legislated. Every firearm I have right now, I have 4 pistols, I have about 10 rifles, and I have lots of ammunition. I have 2 separate gun cabinets. My ammunition and all my accessories are in one gun cabinet. My firearms are in the other cabinet. Every firearm with a trigger lock, every rifle with the bolt removed, and it's locked via code as well. So essentially, to own firearms, that's what you have to comply with in Canada. And again, the safe storage and transportation actually dictates that even when I take my firearms out to use them, I'm transporting them. If they're restricted, they're in a case, they're trigger locked, case is locked. And if they're not, the firearm itself is still trigger locked as well. So that's what I was speaking to when I talk about current legislation. That is a serious prevention of accidental discharge. Every step I have to follow. No step I have to follow prevents me or anybody else from taking a lock off of one of those firearms and using them to commit a crime. Right? No measure they have in place stops anybody from smuggling one across the border and committing harm to another individual as a result of that, right? So that's what we go through in regards to not only vetting and acquiring your license, 24-hour background checks. And this is why logic firearms owners are the most peaceful, safest people in the entire country. This is why we're 1/3 to 1/2 as likely to commit a homicide, is we already abide by the strictest rules on the books to do what we do and have what we have. And a lot of us don't have a problem with that. Like, we're okay with it because it does improve safety in our homes. It does prevent accidental discharge, the whole 9 yards. And we're already set up for it. It doesn't cause a lot of problems for us. But again, we're the ones that get demonized and disarmed, while the criminals still get to walk around freely and just commit homicides and murders freely, right? So yeah, that's that piece when it comes to legislation and what we go through for ownership and everything. I guess, Dominique, the last piece I wanted to go through was the call to action. Are we okay to move forward on that, or did you want to stop?
Well, maybe what we could do is we can go through a few questions, and then
Okay.
we'll wrap up with the call to action.
Okay, yeah, that makes good sense.
So before we start, we got, amongst our questions, we also got a few statements, and because this is the Q&A, this statement really, it made me smile because I thought it was right to the point, and it was written by someone who is Swiss, and he shared with us, "When will this stop? I and most Swiss people have a machine gun at home with 11mm ammunition. In my 35 years living there, 2 people have been murdered with this weapon. I think if you give people responsibility, they become responsible. Unfortunately, the Canadian government treats their citizens like cattle or imbeciles. This is very sad. Don't give up." So thank you Swiss person who shared that with us. I think that was beautifully stated. And yes, and this is actually interesting, enough. One of my sons likes to bring up the fact that, the average citizen in Switzerland has, and they carry pistols. Now,
Yeah.
is this the Wild West? Are you familiar with stats that show that, Swiss people are murdering each other every day in the streets and people are dropping dead from firearms? That's my question.
Yeah, and actually it's interesting because the Swiss are a great example of the socioeconomic conditions that don't exist that result in violent crime and gun homicides and things like that. It's a great example of that separation between licensed, peaceful, law-abiding firearm owners and those conditions that create violent crime. And that's what, we don't have that. And we're like the Swiss, like we actually don't have that element so prominent in Canada that we need a lot of gun control. Because again, virtually nothing they're doing in regards to the disarmament of Canadians is going to result in an improvement in public safety. Demonstrably, that's not going to happen. Right.
Yeah, and we have a few questions along those lines. So I'm going to start with our first question. Are there some specific handguns that are exempt under C21, or are all handguns included?
So the handgun piece isn't so much C21 as it is the fact that they banned the transfer and sale of handguns in Canada prior to C21. So that's almost a separate piece, and that's every handgun. You
Okay.
can't transfer a handgun to anybody in Canada. And again, it's back to that Trojan horse piece. They just have to stop the transfer of handguns, stop the sale and purchase of handguns, because handguns are heavily restricted and you are required to register your handgun. You're required to get an authorization to transport your handgun if you do intend to take it to a range. So just simply prohibiting the transfer of handguns, they are able to stop in its tracks the sale and proliferation of handguns within Canada.
Wow.
Yeah.
So here's another question I thought was interesting. One law for all in the land of Canada. Whatever guns Canada's armed forces, CSIS, RCMP police may have, so may its citizens. How do we repeal all laws that keep that from happening? So interesting question. And you and I had talked about this. It's interesting that you and I could not walk around carrying any kind of protection for our safety, and yet we have all kinds of public figures who are able to hire bodyguards who can themselves carry firearms to protect you.
Yep.
There's a logical disconnect there.
So this comes back to my comments around punching through the target though as well. So logically, yeah, I think you should be able to walk around with a pistol and responsibly manage that pistol, and we can have legislation in place that ensures the responsible. Nobody's safer because I have to put my pistol in an OPOC case and have a trigger lock on it. I mean, if the ammunition in the magazine is not in the pistol, it's equally as safe as it is in that condition. But this is more speaking to the punch through the target philosophy that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm a firm believer that Canadians, firearms owners, should be fighting for the complete repeal of all firearms legislation. That's my belief.
Mm-hmm.
But that is my punch through the target belief, which is if we achieve half of that, we've repealed a lot of stuff that's unnecessary, and we've gotten to a more healthy place than we are right now, right? So that individual that said that is on the right track. And how we do it is enough political pressure that politicians start behaving the right way. And that's what's completely missing. That's why they get to abuse us so severely when it comes to firearms ownership, is there's no consequence, there's no political pressure. And again, most of the conversations I see in firearms forums are based around, when the government comes and takes my firearms, how much money will I get? Like there's no
That's actually one of the
unified
questions
non-compliance, right?
Yeah,
Well, but it's just like that's the absolutely wrong conversation to have. Conversation should be how we become offensive in our strategy here to defeat the government on firearms legislation, not what to expect when they come take them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You're fighting a losing battle as soon as that's the conversation that you're starting to have.
So you're going on the defensive rather than the offensive, and what you're advising all of us is that we need to start going on the offensive.
Dominique, you're asking how bad the bully's going to beat you up.
Yeah.
That's what we're asking when we actually ask that question, right?
Yeah, no, fair enough. Absolutely. So actually in that line, and I'm kind of skipping around through some of the questions because you have addressed quite a few of them, but something that has come up a few times is the discussion of if we were to get a conservative government federally, or perhaps even a conservative government or a new, better conservative government, because we currently have a conservative government right now in Alberta and in several other provinces. Could that change things? So that's part of the question. My part of the question is, in the history of firearms legislation, how many governments have actually been elected, more conservative minding governments, and repealed gun restriction? How many times has that happened?
The only thing that's ever been repealed in the history of Canada is the long gun registry. And the only reason that was repealed was because it was highly ineffective, inefficient, and costly. That's it. That's the only thing that's ever been achieved in regards to the repeal of firearms legislation. Now, throughout the history of firearms legislation in Canada, there's been bouncing back and forth and trying different things to see what's more and less effective. But that's not a repeal. That's actually trying to get the formula right. So in the history of Canada, there's been nothing. And the problem is a lot of people put their faith in conservative politicians to fix the problem. But I'm telling you, if you look at history, if you look at previous regimes that have been in control in Canada, the best we can hope for if they get into power is they're going to put things on pause until the Liberals get back in and start this machine of disarmament again and take our firearms away. There's no repeal that's going to occur without political pressure, without firearms owners, becoming united and actually saying, the most powerful word to me in the English language is nope. You think about millions of firearms owners in Canada being faced with legislation, disarmament, and they just say, nope, not doing it. There have been, historically, there have been so many attempts at disarmament or theories of disarmament that the government has actually entertained, and they didn't pursue them because they didn't think they would be capable of achieving the objective of disarmament when they did it. Actually, if you look between the 1750s and 1867, and even beyond that, there's many times they sat down and said, we would like to disarm the populace, but we don't think they'll comply, so we're not going to do it. And the Indigenous is a great example when they moved to the restrictions on ammunition rather than going into the communities and taking firearms.
Yeah.
They did that because they didn't think they would give up the firearms and it would be ineffective to do so, right? So again, the problem, it's not government, it's not conservative or liberal that does it. All of them are supporting the same system that perpetuates the disarmament of Canadians. It's the firearms owners that aren't acting and waiting for somebody to come save the day, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and interesting because Roger Hodkinson likes to say repeatedly, we need to stop being so nice. Canadians have a reputation for being way too nice. Well, I mean, obviously our reputation is that we're nice people. He's saying we're too nice. We need to stop being nice. We need to start pushing back, standing our ground. And as you said, no is a powerful word. And I'm sure we're all familiar here with Chris Sky and his many rallies and public speaking on united non-compliance. And no matter what we think about any particular advocate, that statement is incredibly important. That if we 100%. Are unified in not complying with something that is immoral and unconstitutional, I'm not talking about not complying with the authorities, when you've broken the law and they're coming after you, when you've done something wrong, when you've acted immorally, but not complying. And actually, it's our duty not to comply with immoral laws and immoral legislation and immoral mandates. It is our duty for ourselves, for our communities, and for our children and our grandchildren. They need to understand that they're under no obligation to obey immoral laws.
Well, and the thing is, too, Dominique, it's always treated as a subjective thing. We need to feel to be opposing to these types of things, but it's actually part of the formula. This is the balance that needs to exist in society. Government will always try to take more. And the opposition of the citizens is what maintains balance. And, part of the strategy and the tactic they've deployed is they've convinced us all to be nice and kind and quiet and compliant, and nobody's willing to actually, but if anybody's followed me for the last 5 years, then my main philosophy is let's be mean about it. Let's do the same stuff they're doing. Let's be as loud as they are, right? They're
Yes.
like everybody thinks we're above us, but that's what loses the battle every step of the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at some of our incredible freedom warriors, people who are willing to go to jail, Pastor Art, Pastor Coates, and a number of other pastors across the country, people like Chris Scott, who was willing to accept fine after fine after fine because he refused. And it's not just Chris, there are lots of businesses that prefer to go under than to comply with immoral mandates and legislation, and doctors who are willing to lose their licenses because they would not inject our children. So, in situations like this, and I guess it's teaching people from having conversations with gents like you and ladies who are familiar with the legislation, what our rights are, is understanding that gun legislation is not moral.
Yep.
Right. And so
it's not moral, and it's completely unjustified. It's an absolutely unjustified revocation of property of Canadians.
There you go. And as one of our questions was, well, what about property rights? Could this not qualify under that? Absolutely. And I think that your argument or your statement that under Section 7, it makes perfect sense that Section 7 would cover our ability to protect ourselves. Why is it I can't protect my family, but anyone can walk to my door with an illegal firearm and start shooting?
Interestingly, too, when you look historically, again, from the 1700s to the 1800s, when we talk about property rights, a qualification that they tried many times to implement was you need to have property to have rights to firearms.
Yeah.
And that was a class type of warfare that they tried to implement so that people who did not have property, which were typically minority groups, could not obtain firearms. But here we are today, and the tie between property rights and firearms is, if we apply the logic of if you have property, the same logic the government used to restrict firearms ownerships in the past, if you have property, you should have firearms to defend your property today. Almost every citizen in Canada should be entitled to firearms under that logic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a number of questions here around if Bill C21 passes. Now, I know you and I and a lot of people here, I'm sure, are not wanting to go down that road, because what we're trying to say is we need to become proactive to do everything we can to push back on that. But if it were to pass, what could I do as a citizen to protect myself from police barging into my house and coming and seizing my guns? Is there anything I can do?
Well, so first thing I want to touch on is if we are actually willing to allow that to happen, not a bad place, because it's going to get real uncomfortable real quick if the police are forced to come in and uncomfortably execute this removal of firearms from homes. I mean, they'll get 5 homes in before the riots start, I'm sure. But really, I think authoritarian governments should be forced to be authoritarian first and foremost. That's just part of my core. The other part is when you look at Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba and what the governments here are doing, they're actually shielding us from this legislation. And I'll tell you, the reason they're doing that is because they know the populace, and they know that if they don't, they will be hit with the type of united non-compliance that we are talking about right now. They are getting ahead of it by not complying with federal legislation and not being willing to entertain it, by actually just taking a stand immediately because they know their populace. The provinces that aren't doing that, it's because the government thinks that the populace will not stand up and be united in their non-compliance with what's being asked of them. So back to your point about Chris Scott and everybody, and again, you can think whatever you want about people, but a very valid message to people is united non-compliance. Again, we look at the trucker convoy and how quickly everything dropped as a result of that. They claimed it wasn't it, but it was awfully interesting that immediately after the convoy measures dropped across the country. So when we look at that, we need to apply the right pressures to our politicians. It starts with your municipal people. We need to make it important to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To the point that they take it forward federally, and it's important federally.
Yeah.
Right. We need to, and not just your municipal federal politicians, but your municipal provincial politicians, because that's who influences the premier in making decisions, like Danielle Smith and Scott Moe and so on.
Yeah.
Right. So Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are actually a great example of what united noncompliance can achieve. We just didn't have to do it because they were so certain that the populace would not be okay with this, that they didn't even give us the chance to do it. They said, we're not going to go along with this because we know what's going to happen. And again, that's the consequence missing in politics today.
Yeah.
That's why the government can stand up and frame us the way they frame us and take our stuff away and abuse us the way they abuse us, is because when they look at the general population, they don't see a consequence there in their actions, right?
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to turn us a little bit towards an issue that is near and dear to my heart and many of our hearts, and that's the World Economic Forum and globalism. There are, do you know who brought the World Economic Forum into Canada?
Harper.
Yeah, so it was thanks to Stephen Harper that we, and then of course in collaboration after him with Pierre Trudeau. Imagine, not Pierre Trudeau. Gosh, that was a Freudian slip. Justin, JT. So, to what extent are these legislations connected to that globalist agenda? Can you draw a connection?
Yeah, let's not kid ourselves. It's a 100% drive behind what we're seeing happen. In Agenda 2030, there's a very clear disarmament requirement. We are signatory to the WEF and Agenda 20. We are signatory to these things from Harper, from Trudeau. There is the main driver behind disarmament, and it is literally framed as disarmament within Agenda 2030. The main driver of disarmament within Canada, objectively, like if you look as far as reasoning goes, what would drive a government to want to disarm the population? Well, we know it's not safety related. We know it's not crime related. It's because the government wants the populace disarmed. We're in modern day and age where we're probably not required to defend ourselves against tyranny. And the government is likely not going to abuse us right now to the point it goes there. The driver behind disarmament of Canadians is Agenda 2030. That is it. I have no doubt in my mind that's it. And I used to, even I was of the thought early on that, maybe that's kind of out there. Read into it. Read Agenda 2030. Read about disarmament. Read about the steps that they're willing to take. And every single thing they're parroting right now and every step they're taking matches the requirements within that agenda.
Well,
everything.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's mirrored almost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And interestingly, we had in our newsletter kind of inviting everybody to join, we did outline some historically since, the turn of the 20th century, some of the governments who implemented massive wide-scale disarmament of their citizens, and then what followed, right? And we can go to Germany, World War II, prior to World War II. We can look at Cambodia, we can look at China, we can look at any communist nation, we can look at Cuba. Citizens were not allowed to carry guns. This is very much the move of authoritarianism. No, we don't need you to protect yourself because we're going to do that. It's definitely something worth considering. So if we're looking at calls to action, right? So let's touch on that a little bit, because a lot of the questions are around what can I do? How do I protect myself? How do I become proactive? And one of the questions actually, and I'm not sure if we addressed this, was if I don't currently have a license, a permit, will I be able to get one with all of this? And we've had a few people in the chat, as well as a few of the questions where, I did my PAL, I did my firearms course, and I've been waiting 6 months, 5 months, they're delayed, they're backlogged with all of these, what do I do? Am I going to get my permit?
Yeah, 5 and 6 months, even under normal conditions, isn't unheard of.
Okay.
I would definitely follow up lots and make sure that it's being processed. They can actually provide you updates on the status and where it's at in the process, the whole 9 yards. Second to that, there's lots of stuff that's I would advise if you're going to buy stuff, buy non-restricted firearms, buy rifles that are interesting. Like my WK-180C is a very interesting, capable, functional, great firearm. And it's a Canadian made, it's Kodiak, it's Canadian made. It's actually non-restricted, which means that automatically there's no record of you owning it in the government's hands. As soon as you buy a non-restricted rifle, that's the case. So I've got lots of handguns and stuff like that are restricted, but the government knows about those. But if you buy non-restricted rifles, there's no registry, there's nothing that actually, other than the store's records and receipts that says you have it, right? So I would advise on that if somebody's getting into it and purchasing. And I would say, like, for a long time we're probably still going to get a PAL or an RPAL, but they're going to keep tightening the noose around what you can acquire once you get that license, right? I think that the last nail in the coffin is to remove your ability to acquire a firearm. Everybody will be, just like we saw, everybody keeps asking, what rights did you lose in the last 2 years? It's like, well, if I have to explain this to you, you're obviously in the wrong state of mind. But we'll be in that state of, oh, you have a right to obtain firearms. You can get your license, but the last thing they will do is to close that door, and it'll be more out of, it's just not necessary versus they're actually going to accomplish anything, because they will have restricted firearms to such a point that you just can't acquire anything useful or capable at that point. I mean, I have no doubt that the path we're on is to bring us to the point that we only have bolt action rifles that are capable of firing one round.
Well,
at a maximum, that's what they want to leave us with, right? Yep. At a maximum, I believe that's the intent to leave us with, just that, right?
So here we, and I think I already asked this question: what can firearm owners do if the police come knocking on their doors wanting to take their legally owned firearms? And so, for example, now you're saying do your best to purchase unrestricted firearms, but again, if they pass legislation to restrict firearms that are currently unrestricted, what is the likelihood? Like, would you encourage people to turn them in for a buyback, or what would one do?
You want me to say exactly what I think, Dominique?
If you're willing to, I would love to hear it.
I think that if they want to go door to door and take firearms for people, they should be required to bring acetylene torches with them and cut them out of people's gun safes. I would never say that anybody should ever take violent action or put themselves at risk. I would never recommend that for anybody. Again, this should not be an easy task for them to accomplish. And if somebody comes with the intent to take my stuff, I don't know where the keys are. I don't know the code. And again, make them be authoritarian the way they intend to. Make them expose themselves as being that.
Film it.
And you might unfortunately be the victim of the government who comes and cuts your guns out of your safe, but let them get 10 houses in and see how comfortable it is. And again, historically, many times they have moved backwards on their desire to legislate gun ownership and gun limitations, because they did not think they could accomplish their objective, right? So again, be safe, be careful, don't put yourself at risk, don't be a martyr. But at the same time, don't make it easy. Like, they knock on the door, it's like, sure, I don't know the code, I don't have the key. Where's your acetylene torches? Go take them. Go ahead. Have fun. And I'll tell you, with social media, with everything we have, get 10 houses in and see what kind of uproar there is. And they'll be stopping pretty quickly, I'm sure of it, right?
So, well, that's definitely something worth kind of noting as a potential call to action. Hopefully it doesn't get to that, right? And we certainly aren't wishing that people are going to come knocking down anyone's door.
100%.
Right.
Ultimately, the perfect state is we're applying enough political pressure. So ultimately, the paradigm has shifted. Firearms owners, the 2 million firearms owners in Canada, understand the objective is to disarm you, not to make people safer. So we understand the evil that we're actually dealing with. We stop defensively trying to predict what the government will do and how it will affect us and what we can hopefully keep versus what they're going to take. And we stop praying for mercy from daddy government. And then finally is the united non-compliance. Let's stand up. let's make sure that our arms are joined in a way
Mhm.
that they don't want to come into our houses and take them. It's not hard, it's not easy, and it's very uncomfortable. The
Yeah.
government needs to look at the firearm owners, the population of firearms owners in Canada, and make the same decision that governments have made historically. We're going to have a real difficult time with this. It's not going to work, so let's not do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I guess there's a few things here. And one is in terms of a call to action. I'm putting this out there for you to let me know what you think of a call to action around this, but encouraging our attendees, anybody watching this video now or later on, to start writing letters to their MLAs, to their MPs, to their senators, and petitioning for them not to stop Bill C21. That could be part of it, but to start rolling back the current legislation.
Yeah.
Is that something that's a reasonable call to action for people?
Yeah, and we need to be careful, because nowadays people tend to be a lot less understanding of the amount of force required here, right? So we think, one and done and we're good. What's missing is a culture of force. What's missing is the consistent wearing away of government objectives and intentions. What's missing is the daily conversations. What's missing is that grind that really clearly informs the government of what the boundaries are. And I don't want anybody to leave a conversation like this and think that we're going to go send one letter and have one conversation and attend one protest and we're good.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's where society is today. I've been grinding for 5 years, doing commentary for thousands of hours at this point in time. And I still don't feel like it's even remotely enough to achieve any kind of objective here. So people need to understand the government ability to withstand what we do is tremendous. So this armchair quarterback, I don't like it. I'm going to protest slightly. I'm going to sign a petition. There needs to be real public pressure on politicians to behave the right way. It starts with your local representatives.
Yeah.
It starts with your local provincial. They're the people who are going to drive the government who provincially to take the same stance as Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba and shield us. But then we also have local federal politicians who actually report into Ottawa. They need to feel the same pressure, right?
Absolutely.
And again, I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic. I know where society is today, but it's a big push.
Yeah.
It's not. There's
Yeah.
no easy call to action here that anybody can achieve quickly.
Yeah, and it's not going to be
Right.
a one and done. I completely agree. It has to be persistent, right? Any
Yep.
change that we want, we need to be committed to. And that means those of you out there who are listening, who are letter writers, and I know quite a few who would happily and gladly sit down and write letter after letter. They have the time, they have the will, but even those of us who don't, to get involved, and I've heard it before, oh, what is letter writing going to do? Well, it's actually, it's a start. We're going to start filling their inboxes, and write physical letters, first of all, I think is way more effective than emails. But if you can't, then send emails. The other thing that came up in a conversation recently, Mark Friesen is a big advocate for
I love Mark
town
Friesen.
halls. He's an awesome guy.
He's one of my
Really,
favorite people.
yeah, stellar soul and quite the freedom fighter, very outspoken, and he doesn't really care if people like what he has to say or not. He has to speak the truth. So I respect that in him. But he talks a lot about town halls, and I remember, I've been around long enough. This isn't blonde, it's white. When MPs used to have regular town halls where their constituents could attend and talk to them about issues that were near and dear to them. What has happened to those? So I'm putting out to you guys, let's start getting together and formulating town halls and invite our politicians to attend. Who cares if they don't show up to the first one or the second one or the third one? One, we get together as a community, we build that connection and that strength. Two, eventually, we're gonna browbeat them into eventually showing up, we hope. And yeah, sure, there's going to be some who won't. But even if a handful do, it's a start. So I really think we need to become more involved politically and start calling out those who have been elected ostensibly to represent our best interests.
Yeah, and Dominique, that's a great point. So I would never discount any form of pressure we're willing to apply. So if it's letter writing, things like that, there's a specific type of formula when you have people face to face and the right pressure is applied. And people are looking you in the eyes and saying, you know, I will take accountability. I will bring this forward. It's a very specific type of pressure. And we have a system that is rotting from within because none of that pressure exists on any matter today. So, and this is where the firearms issue is no different than any other issue that anybody's advocating for here. It's another thing that the root cause of the issue with firearms is the complete absence of consequence and pressure within our political system, right?
Exactly.
If we can establish that pressure centrally and effectively,
Mhm.
we'll get better results with firearms. We'll get
100%.
better results with Constitution. We'll
Yeah.
get better results with the Charter of Rights. We'll get better results all around. It's just
Absolutely.
completely absent here today. And that's why
Absolutely.
the firearms legislation piece, that's why I say this is not an easy fix. This is a big thing that needs to be done here if we actually want to maintain some rights and freedoms here, right?
Absolutely. So do you know of any political party who has as part of its platform, and it's someone mentioned in one of the questions, other than the Christian Heritage Party, anywhere across Canada, whether it's provincially or federally, that has a stand on protecting our rights around firearms? Do you know of any political party that does that?
So I want to be clear here first. So I don't typically, like I used to, I don't anymore. I don't endorse political parties. I'm a firm believer in voting for the right politician for your local, for the local, like federally and provincially, the right person for the role locally. I think if most Canadians adopted that, we'd end up with a better situation. People tend to elect leaders and not local politicians, right? But the PPC did always have that in their platform. They were firm believers of firearms rights. I interviewed Maxime Bernier face to face here in Fort McMurray, and we spoke extensively about his support for firearms rights and how he thinks there should be no disarmament of Canadians, and that legislation should be repealed. So and I know people roll their eyes when you say PPC, but and it comes back to that idea regarding an armament of a population. You're never going to defeat the government, but you will apply enough pressure that they don't want to act. And that was one of the places that I did, the PPC and their representatives appealed to me. It wasn't because I ever thought they'd win any kind of significant majority of the vote, but it was an opportunity to apply pressure that actually changed the behavior of the Conservative Party.
Wow.
Right. And that's what we saw as a result of that was we saw people actually start to realize that, hey, that was a form of consequence for actions. Okay, we're not being conservatives anymore. Well, there's consequence. You're actually losing share of vote. People called it vote splitting, the whole 9 yards, but it was actually the application of consequence within the political system, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And yeah, certainly I wasn't asking you to advocate necessarily for a political party, but I was curious because, to be honest, I don't know. I couldn't answer that question. And so it's interesting. I didn't realize that the PPC had that as part of their platform. So I mean, I think it's important to note. And if we have, even if it's not part of a political party platform, certainly I like the idea of focusing on individual representatives who are asking for us to trust them. That's a question I think worth asking any politician in whatever constituency you're in. Before you decide to go to the polls and vote for them, find out where they stand on firearm rights, right? Find out where they stand on your right to make a choice about medical interventions. Find out where they stand on whether or not they support the idea of allowing a globalist agenda to infiltrate into our country, but into our province, and dictate to us what kind of emissions we should have, what kind of firearms we can carry, how we can protect ourselves. So,
and you know, the consequence is that they might not get your vote. And like I often get into debates with people who make the claim that if you don't vote, you can't complain. And it's like, so you're telling me if I have a choice between cow manure and chicken manure for dinner, can't complain about my options? It's like, really? Like, because that's the state we end up in, right?
Yeah. Dr. Lana reminded us what kind of stoves we can have. Right, whether, oh, and my favorite, the latest one that we're hearing so much about, I mean, we've known about this for a while, is the 15-minute cities, right? Pilot project up in Edmonton, where we're not going to have to drive cars, so we won't use gas. And oh, how, because CO2 is a big danger, but that's a whole other conversation as well.
And we haven't applied enough consequence where they stop talking about this ridiculous stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's where we need to be willing to stand and to push back and not be afraid and not listen to the talking around the subject. I'm so tired of people talking around the subject. Give me a straight answer.
Yep.
I think we covered most of the questions in your talk. A lot of the questions that we had, you covered really well. And thank you for that response on the WEF. I absolutely believe that this was part of their agenda, and I continue to believe that. So before we wrap up, Lana, did you pick up any questions in the chat that we haven't found any answers to or haven't addressed yet that you're aware of?
No, I think it was mostly statements, Dominique. This has been very informative, and thank you so much, Rob, for all of this information. It's mind-blowing, really. So, and just a more extension of the the censorship, the marketing, the government overreach, like the complete insanity. Government isn't supposed to be so involved in our lives, and wow, they're really trying to get in there on every level. So like you said, we need to push back and just say no.
And Lana, again, it's like, let's stop treating them like they're stupid, because they're not even
No,
remotely.
no,
they know exactly what they're doing, right?
Well, and I think if we've learned anything in the last almost 3 years now, is that this isn't the behavior of stupid people. Ignorant, evil, maybe, but they're not stupid. They definitely know what they're doing, and they've been doing it quite effectively, because look at where we're at. And I found it really compelling when you talked about where this all started, disarming our Indigenous communities, and the fear mongering around that. I mean, if I had two members of the Indigenous community last year, say to me, Dominique, you all are living what we've been living for decades. Maybe you understand what we've been going through, and this push to further limit our ability to access our own self-defense. Well, you've tied that beautifully into historically where that originates from. It doesn't originate from a desire to protect us. The very fact that in the American Constitution, they have the Second Amendment, that was never to do anything more effectively than to protect you from an authoritarian, tyrannical government. And I think it's reasonable to assume that Section 7 could cover that too. I don't know, maybe one of these days we're going to have to test that.
We got a lot of pressure to apply before we unliberalize our Supreme Court.
Yes, so fair enough. Well, yeah, there's a lot of change that we need. So, before we wrap up, I want to thank you again. That was really educational and informative. I hope our participants found it as informative as I personally found it. Maybe I'm more naive than the average Canadian. And I hope our viewers who are going to see this tonight through social media, but maybe later on pick up on it, will find some very interesting gems in there. I think Lana had wanted to ask something, so I'll let her go, and then I'll wrap up with just a few little comments and updates.
Yeah, there's just a good question actually in the chat, excellent. Can Alberta, or any province for that matter, I would say, stop the federal government from enforcing the gun control? Like, is that in our provincial legislation that we could actually stop what they're trying to do? And is that something we should be, advocating for, pushing for, educating for, and ensuring that happens in our provinces?
Yeah, and actually, Alberta's a good example of the beginning of the slippery slope in the opposite direction, in my opinion, because what the provincial government has done, they haven't said that the government or the provincial government and courts will not prosecute. What they're doing is providing guidance to the courts to prosecute a specific way, and to me, that is a beginning of because all of this is interpretation and logic that's applied, and that's a change in the logic that's being applied to the firearms control legislation that's being put forward. So it's a great start. It's not to say that, like, I think Alberta is fully capable of implementing their own police force if it came down to it, and dictating their own laws and actually getting a lot of autonomy that way. But even just starting there at that point where the opposition is, where we are going to provide guidance, it's not direction, but it's guidance to the courts to consider specific things when proceeding with this type of action. What it does is it empowers that united non-compliance. So now the populace feels more comfortable not complying and taking the risk prosecution. And as precedent gets set within the courts of not prosecuting, eventually these laws erode to the point that they're just not enforceable. So to me, that's kind of the path that I see with Alberta. It's a great start. It doesn't mean that we're going to win, but I just feel like it kind of sends us down that path. If we use what the provincial government in Alberta is giving us as a gift effectively, we end up in a place where the laws are considered to be unable to be enforced because the courts have deemed them to be unprosecutable. Therefore, everybody just kind of behaves as they would like to behave with their firearms in Alberta, right?
And my understanding is within the current constitution, we absolutely have the authority to have our own police force, where we, and in that case, you know, if the federal, if the RCMP and the federal police force decides to try and process or arrest people, well, if they weren't here, if we had our own police force, that would be very difficult for them to do. So I think it's really important that we recognize that currently, constitutionally, we absolutely can have our own police force. We can regulate our own healthcare system. We can regulate our own education system, and we need to be pressuring our governments to do that 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
100%, I agree.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much, Rob. I just want to remind everybody, Dr. Lana already mentioned that TBOF is going to be supporting Christine Anderson on her tour in February 18th. She will be in Calgary. She's going to be across Canada. You can go to her website. I think Lana posted it in the chat, but if you don't mind popping in there again, Lana, I would super appreciate that. And you can go, I think they're going to 4 cities. I believe it's Toronto, Calgary, or maybe it's 3, and Montreal, but you can clarify that on her website. Please go. This woman has been an absolute lioness speaking out against what is it, Agenda 2030 and the WEF. So, you know, we need more outspoken public figures. So go enjoy it. I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun. There is also another event coming up. Posters will be going out on March 4th. It will be an information conference on the World Economic Forum, globalism, and how it came into Canada and how it currently still exists here in Canada, and what we as a citizenry can do about it. So I encourage you to follow that, please. I want to thank Rob again so much for his information. I think he put his website in the chat, but if not, you can go to TBOF.ca. And we have some connections and website links. Rob, if you want to pop your website link in the chat, if you can, where people can get your information. And then I think that was about it. Also, if you're interested in the upcoming National Citizens Inquiry and its progress, please go to their website. Lana, I'm going to ask you to pop that in the chat too, if you can, the NCI website, to get updates on that. I believe they are still looking for potential commissioners. There is a spot on the website where you can go and recommend commissioners. So please do, if you know of anybody who you think would be a good fit to help in that process. And I think for tonight, that's about it. We will have an upcoming webinar in the month of February. It will be on Bill C21. Again, more government overreach, guys. And we have a very special guest who will be coming to discuss that legislation and the legislation that led to that, and that we've been continuing to see around how we get shut up and shut down by our federal government. So please pay close attention to our website and see what's coming up. Please go and register. It costs nothing. You'll get regular updates. You'll get the newsletters and information there. So again, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. It's been really fun. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I feel like I'm walking away with so much new information in my head. So thank you so much, Rob, for joining us tonight. And I look forward to further communications with you around all of this and supporting you and what you're doing. Thanks again. And Dr. Lana, as always, it's always fun to see your smiling face. Thanks so much for coming on. Thank you very much, everyone. God bless you. Have a good night, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again.
Everybody, have a good night.
Thank you,
Good night.
Rob. Thank you, Dominique.